Tonight, we are slipping into a city under siege where the only thing colder than the -30-degree wind is the hunger gnawing at 1,000,000 empty stomachs. For 872 days, Leningrad became a frozen graveyard. Bread rations dropped to 125 grams a day, half of it sawdust. People boiled wallpaper paste for soup, and in the deepest winter, whispers of cannibalism drifted through the snow. A mass famine so deliberate, some call it genocide. How did an entire city starve while surrounded by enemies and ice? Welcome to history's longest and most lethal siege. Let's find out. This is the story of a city that refused to die, even when the world decided it should. Before the war, Leningrad was a masterpiece of the Russian Empire, a sprawling metropolis of palaces, canals, and over 3 million souls. But in the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler issued a directive that would transform that jewel into an open-air tomb. He had no interest in capturing Leningrad. He wanted to wipe it from the map entirely. The plan was chillingly simple. Encircle the city, cut every supply line, and let starvation do the killing. The siege that followed would become the longest and deadliest in modern history. 872 days of hunger, darkness, and unimaginable cold. More than 1.5 million civilians perished, a death toll that eclipses the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Rations dropped to a sliver of bread, 125 grams a day, half of it sawdust. People devoured wallpaper paste, gnawed on boiled leather, and in the deepest winter, whispers of cannibalism drifted through the frozen streets. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Corpses piled up in doorways because the living had no strength to bury them. Yet here is the paradox that historians still struggle to explain. While a city was being starved into the ground, its heart kept beating. A starving orchestra scraped together a performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, blasting it through loudspeakers to defy the German lines. A 12-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva wrote a diary recording the deaths of her entire family, one by one, until only she was left. And inside a legendary seed bank, scientists guarded a priceless collection of crops, dying of hunger themselves rather than eat a single grain. So how do you survive when civilization itself has collapsed? What does it take to remain human when the only rule is to feed yourself by any means necessary? That is the question we're going to answer tonight. We're stepping onto the road of life, walking the empty, corpse-strewn avenues, and staring into a hunger so total it rewrote what it means to endure. Let's go back to September 8, 1941. The moment the last road out of Leningrad was cut and the clock on the longest siege in history began to tick. On September 8, 1941, German forces of Army Group North reached the shores of Lake Ladoga and took the small fortress town of Schlisselburg. That capture closed the last land corridor into Leningrad. The city was now an island, cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. 3 million people, including 400,000 children, were trapped inside a tightening noose. The siege had begun, and the German High Command was not shy about its intentions. A directive from Hitler's headquarters stated plainly, there would be no surrender accepted. The city was to be erased from the face of the earth, its population annihilated not by bullet, but by the slow, grinding machinery of starvation. To understand why Leningrad was targeted with such venom, you have to understand what it represented. This was not merely a strategic prize. It was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the ideological heart of the Soviet state. It was a cultural capital of palaces, theaters, and scientific institutes. For the Nazis, Leningrad symbolized everything they despised. Crushing, it would deliver a psychological blow beyond any military victory. So the order was given: encircle, bombard, and wait. Let hunger do the rest. The first hours of the siege brought fire and chaos. On that very same day, the Luftwaffe launched a massive air raid. Bombs rained down on the city's network of wooden food warehouses, known as the Badayev warehouses. These buildings stored a significant portion of the city's reserves, thousands of tons of flour, sugar, butter, and grain. The bombardment ignited a firestorm that could be seen for miles. Citizens ran to the blaze with buckets, trying desperately to salvage something, anything from the flames. Melted sugar ran in rivers down the streets, mixing with ash and dirt. People scooped it up with their hands, already sensing the catastrophe. In a single afternoon, a supply that could have prolonged the city's survival for weeks vanished into the sky. Some historians have debated the exact impact of the Badayev fire, given that overall reserves were already dangerously low. But for the people of Leningrad, the symbolism was as devastating as the loss itself. The city watched its future go up in smoke. Within days, the food situation became the city's central obsession. Authorities inventoried what remained. Enough flour for about 30 days, enough meat for 33, fats and sugar for 45. That was at normal consumption levels. There was no possibility of resupply by land. The siege ring was complete. The only way in or out was by air, under heavy enemy fire, or across the unpredictable waters of Lake Ladoga. And winter was coming. You might ask, why didn't they evacuate everyone before the trap snapped shut? The painful truth is that the Soviet leadership grossly underestimated the speed of the German advance. Evacuations had been haphazard, chaotic. Factory workers, children, and the elderly were sent out. But the decisions were slow, tangled in bureaucracy. By the time the ring closed, over 2.5 million civilians remained. Stalin, in his ruthless calculus, prioritized military production over civilian safety, demanding that the city's factories keep running at all costs. The people were expected to fight, to build tanks and munitions, to dig anti-tank ditches even as their stomachs emptied. The first ration cards were issued in July 1941, before the siege, but they were generous by the standards of what was to come. Workers got 800 grams of bread per day, dependents 600. After the encirclement, the cuts began almost immediately. On September 2nd, even before the ring was sealed, rations were reduced. By mid-September, they were down to 500 grams for workers, 300 for office employees, and 250 for children and dependents. But the worst was yet to come. As September turned to October, the reality of the blockade set in. The Luftwaffe and artillery pounded the city daily. The municipal food supply dwindled. The authorities started substituting flour with every possible filler: mill dust, cottonseed cake, even processed cellulose. The bread became darker, denser, and less nourishing. People stood in lines for hours, often under shelling, clutching their ration cards as if they were holy relics. Losing a ration card was a death sentence. Theft and forgery of cards became rampant, and the NKVD, the secret police, set up special squads just to combat food crimes. But it was the weather that turned a crisis into a mass death event. By late October, the temperature began to plummet. Leningrad sits on the same latitude as northern Newfoundland, and its winters are brutal. In November, the mercury dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Snow blanketed the streets. The city's central heating system, powered by fuel that no longer existed, failed. Water pipes froze solid and burst. Electricity was cut to everything except hospitals and defense plants. Citizens were forced to fetch water from the Neva River or from broken mains in the street, dodging artillery shells and slipping on ice. Inside their apartments, people burned furniture, books, and floorboards in tiny stoves they called burjwaikas, just to keep a single room barely above freezing. The cold became a second enemy, as merciless as the Germans. With transport paralyzed by ice and snow, even moving a few kilometers to a food distribution point became an impossible journey for the weak and elderly. People collapsed in the streets and did not get up. The first mass deaths came in November. The official tally counted 11,000 fatalities that month, but the real number was likely higher. Cemeteries filled, and the ground froze so hard that graves could not be dug. Bodies were left in hospital morgues, in courtyards, in abandoned apartments. Meanwhile, the only lifeline was Lake Ladoga, a vast inland sea east of the city. In late November, the ice thickened enough to support trucks. The Soviets called it the Road of Life. It was a desperate, narrow highway across the frozen lake, constantly shelled and bombed by German artillery and planes. The first convoys brought precious flour and sugar, but the quantities were pitifully small. The ice was too thin at first. Trucks broke through and sank, taking drivers and supplies to a freezing grave. In the initial weeks, the Road of Life delivered only a fraction of what the city needed to survive. The daily bread ration for civilians was cut again and again. On November 20th, it hit the catastrophic low, 250 grams for workers, 125 grams for everyone else. That second number, 125 grams, is roughly the weight of a small apple, and half of that was in edible filler, sawdust and cellulose. It was not food, it was a stomach filler that offered no nutrition. The caloric value was barely 300 calories, and adult human needs around 2,000 to survive. The math was simple and lethal. To stretch the nothing they had, people boiled belts, shoes, anything made of leather, to extract a thin, salty soup. They scraped the paste from wallpaper and ate it because it contained traces of potato starch. Rats, crows, pigeons, household pets, all disappeared from the city. In the Haymarket, the central square, something unspeakable began to happen. Desperate, hollow-eyed figures started offering meat patties for sale, meat that looked unlike any animal. By November, the authorities had discovered what was being sold and banned ground meat entirely. Rumors of cannibalism, whispered at first, became official police cases. The NKVD formed a special division to deal with the most savage crime born of starvation. Over 2,000 people would eventually be arrested for cannibalism during the siege. But the full horror was still to come. December brought no relief. Temperatures plunged to -30, then -35. The city's water supply collapsed completely, and the sewage system froze. Sanitation vanished. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery broke out. In their apartments, families huddled together in the dark, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they owned, too weak to speak. The daily ritual was a trek through the snow to collect a small chunk of black, icy bread. Then back to the Berdzarika to melt snow for water. The death rate skyrocketed. In December alone, 52,000 Leningraders perished, most from starvation. The streets became morgues. Sleds replaced coffins as people dragged the bodies of their loved ones to collection points, often dying themselves on the way. And yet, even as the city froze and starved, something stubborn refused to break. Factories continued to produce tanks and shells. The shelling never stopped. Theaters remained open, putting on plays with actors so weak they could barely stand. At the radio station, a metronome ticked constantly, a steady heartbeat broadcast to every apartment to remind the trapped citizens that the city was still alive. This defiance was not just propaganda, it was a survival mechanism, a refusal to surrender to the abyss. The first Christmas under siege passed in darkness and silence. By the new year of 1942, the daily bread ration was still 125 grams, sometimes less. The only increase came for soldiers and essential factory workers who got 350 grams, still a starvation diet. The Road of Life, now frozen solid, managed to increase deliveries slightly, but the trucks bringing food out had to bring evacuees back. The process was agonizingly slow and dangerous. Scholars estimate that over 500,000 people would eventually be evacuated across the ice, but many died on the journey, their bodies abandoned on the frozen lake. In January, the worst month, the death toll peaked at over 100,000 in 31 days. The city's population simply began to evaporate. Blocks of apartment buildings fell silent. The municipal services could not keep up with body collection. Corpses were stacked in courtyards like firewood. And in the midst of this horror, the human mind, pushed beyond endurance, began to crack. It was in January that a 12-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva started writing in her small notebook, recording the deaths of her family, one by one. Her entries were devastatingly matter-of-fact. Zhenya died on December 28th at 12:30 p.m. Grandma died on January 25th at 3 p.m., and so on until the final line. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. Her story was just one of millions, but its simplicity captured the totality of the siege's devastation. So how does a city, pushed to the very edge of extinction, keep its soul intact? What rises from the ashes when the rules of civilization are stripped away? The hunger winter had not yet reached its full, unspeakable conclusion. And in the frozen darkness, something even more terrifying than starvation was taking shape, something that would force the survivors to confront the ultimate question. What does it mean to be human when eating another human becomes the only way to stay alive? That is what lies ahead in the deep freeze of 1942. But first, we need to step into the city at its breaking point and meet the people who faced that question every single day. Step into Leningrad in January 1942. The temperature is 30 below zero, and the wind off the Neva River slices through every layer of clothing like a razor. The streets are silent, not with peace, but with the heavy stillness of a cemetery. Snowdrifts bury the tramcars where they froze in their tracks months ago. Every building is dark, every window hollow. The only movement comes from small, dark figures pulling sleds. On the sleds are not firewood or belongings, but bodies, wrapped in sheets or old curtains, being dragged to collection points. Some of the figures pulling the sleds are children as young as 8 or 9, their faces expressionless, their feet wrapped in rags. They have become the undertakers because the adults are too weak to walk. This is the 124th day of the siege, and the city is in its death throes. To understand how 3 million people were pushed to this point, you have to follow the daily ritual of a single Leningrader. Wake up in the dark. The apartment is freezing, the wallpaper peels from the walls, not from age, but because someone scraped it for the paste. The windows are boarded up, the glass shattered by shelling. There is no running water, so the first task is to bundle up and walk to the nearest hole in the ice, either on the river or a broken main, to fill a bucket. The line at the water hole can take an hour. Stand there, shivering, and watch the people around you. They are skeletons in overcoats. Their eyes are sunken, their skin stretched tight over cheekbones. Nobody speaks. Nobody has the energy. Water collected. You return to the apartment and fire up the burjwika, a tiny cast iron stove made from a metal barrel or a looted car part. You feed it with broken furniture, pages ripped from books, floorboards pried up from the corner of the room. The little fire provides a small bubble of warmth, enough to melt the ice for a cup of watery tea, if you have any tea. Then, the most crucial task of the day, the bread line. You clutch your ration card, that sacred scrap of paper, and walk, sometimes kilometers, to the distribution point. The line is already a silent crowd of wraiths. German shells often land nearby. Nobody flinches. The prospect of death is not as frightening as missing the bread. When you reach the front, you hand over your card, and a weary clerk cuts you a piece of the small loaf, weighs it, and hands it over. 125 grams of black, dense, bitter bread. You hold it carefully, because if it drops, if a crumb is lost, the despair might actually kill you. Then you hurry home and divide it into tiny pieces, spreading consumption across the entire day to fool your stomach into thinking it is being fed. This bread was not bread as we know it. The flour was stretched with every conceivable adulterant. Sawdust, cottonseed cake, cellulose, even sweepings from mill floors. Bakers experimented with malt, oat husks, and processed pine bark. The result was a heavy, sticky substance that tasted of earth and bitterness. It provided nearly zero nutrition, but it filled the stomach, giving a brief reprieve from the relentless gnawing. For many, however, the reprieve was temporary. The body, starved of protein and fat, began to consume itself. The stages of starvation were meticulously documented by Leningrad's doctors, even as they themselves were dying. The first phase is hunger pangs, sharp and insistent, driving the victim to search frantically for any scrap. Then the body starts to swell. Edema, the accumulation of fluid, makes the face puffy, the legs balloon, the belly distend. This is a cruel trick. The victim looks heavier, almost healthier, but it is a sign of organ failure. After the swelling comes the wasting. Muscles vanish, skin drapes over bones, and the person becomes a living anatomical illustration. They can no longer walk. They shuffle. Their voice becomes a whisper. Their mind drifts in and out of lucidity. Hallucinations are common. Survivors reported vivid dreams of feasts, of tables groaning with bread and butter, of their mother's cooking, so real they could smell it. Then they would wake to the dark, frozen room, and the knowledge that none of it was real. Some lost the will to live at that point. They simply lay down and stopped moving. This was called dystrophy, but it was death by inches. The communal apartments, where multiple families shared a single kitchen and bathroom, became silent tombs. In one room, a family of 4 might be reduced to 2, then 1, then none. The survivors were too weak to remove the bodies. Corpses lay in bed for days, weeks, because the living could not lift them, and the morgue sleds never came. Neighbors learned to prop open doors so they could later retrieve the ration cards of the dead. That sounds monstrous, but survival had stripped away nearly all social norms. A ration card from a dead person meant an extra slice of bread, and an extra slice meant another day alive. And then there were the children. One of the most disturbing aspects of the siege was how quickly children were forced to adapt to a world of horror. A 12-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva became the city's most famous victim, but her experience was tragically common. After her sister Zenya died, Tanya took her small notebook and began recording the deaths. She wrote in large, uneven letters, preserving a child's simplicity. The final entry, "Only Tanya is left," was written after her mother died. Tanya herself was evacuated in the summer of 1942, but she was so ravaged by dystrophy and tuberculosis that she died 2 years later, one of the siege's countless delayed casualties. Her diary was used at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of Nazi atrocities. But in the winter of 42, there were thousands of Tanyas, orphaned and starving, wandering the streets in search of a bit of warmth, a crust, a human voice. As the famine deepened, the city's food supply chain became a battlefield unto itself. The official rations were so low that nearly everyone who survived did so because of alternative sourcing. This meant the black market, a parallel economy, emerged in the shadows of the dying city. People bartered everything: family heirlooms, wedding rings, fur coats, anything that could be traded for a handful of flour or a chunk of horse meat. The currency was bread, not rubles. A gold watch might buy a loaf. A diamond ring might get you a bag of frozen potatoes. The NKVD tried to crack down, but even the policemen were starving. Corruption was endemic. Bakers skimmed flour, distribution clerks sold cards to the highest bidder, and the criminal underworld thrived. Gangs specialized in ration card theft. They would follow a person home from the distribution point, beat them senseless, and steal the card. Murder for cards became so common that by the spring of 1942, the police had recorded over 1,200 such killings. People slept with their ration cards sewn into their undergarments, if they had any undergarments left. But the darkest corner of this shadow economy was the emergence of cannibalism. The rumors had started in November, when a group of emaciated women were arrested for selling meat patties at the Haymarket. The meat was tested and found to be human. The city was horrified, but not entirely surprised. When the official NKVD report on cannibalism was compiled, it classified cases into two types: murder for cannibalism and the consumption of the already dead. The former was treated as a capital crime, the latter as a lesser offense, often punished with imprisonment. By the end of the siege, over 2,000 people would be arrested for cannibalism, and the true number was certainly higher. Some of the cases were so grotesque that they were suppressed, even in internal police reports. There were stories of parents feeding on their own children, of funeral homes raided for corpses, of isolated apartment blocks where such practices became open secrets. But here is the strange thing. Despite the lurid horror of these cases, cannibalism remained statistically rare. Far more people died quietly of starvation than resorted to eating the dead. The vast majority of Leningraders clung to their humanity, even at the cost of their lives. This is the part that historians struggle to explain. Why did some cross the line and others not? What inner reservoir of morality kept a parent from feeding on a child when both were dying? There is no simple answer. But the people who resisted the darkness did so through a fierce commitment to the idea of civilization, to the belief that the siege would end and that there would be a day when bread would be bread again. That belief was fed, in part, by the one lifeline that connected Leningrad to the outside world, the road of life across Lake Ladoga. The ice road was the city's aorta. By January 1942, it was a 20 to 30-kilometer highway of ice, marked by traffic controllers and lit by kerosene lanterns. Truck drivers, mostly young women because the men were at the front, drove in convoys through the night, often with their headlights off to avoid German bombers. They kept the doors of their trucks open so they could jump if the ice cracked. The journey was harrowing. German artillery shells exploded around them, sometimes punching holes in the ice. Trucks would suddenly disappear into the dark water, taking their drivers and their cargo with them. The drivers who survived told of seeing the faces of the drowned, frozen in the ice below, staring up as if waiting for rescue. Despite the danger, the road of life was the only hope. By late January, the tonnage being delivered had increased enough to permit a tiny increase in rations. On December 25th, the workers' bread ration was raised from 250 grams to 350, and dependents from 125 to 200. It was still a starvation diet, but it was a psychological turning point. The increase meant that the city was not entirely forgotten. Stalin, who had initially shown little concern for Leningrad's suffering, finally sent a trusted ally, Alexei Kosygin, to oversee the evacuation and supply efforts. Kosygin arrived in January, walking the frozen lake himself to inspect the route. Under his direction, a pipeline was laid across the ice in the spring to pump fuel, and the evacuation of civilians accelerated. 500,000 people would be taken out across the lake by April, but it was a race against time, because when the ice melted in the spring, the city would be an island once more. Even as the death rate peaked, the city's cultural life refused to die. The radio was Leningrad's heartbeat. The famous metronome ticked constantly, a slow, steady beat that said, "We are still here." When the metronome stopped, it meant a bombing raid was imminent. But between the shelling, the radio broadcast poetry, news, and music. Theaters stayed open, performing plays with actors who had to be fed extra rations just to have the strength to stand on stage. In the Philharmonic Hall, which was unheated and dark, the city's remaining musicians gathered to rehearse. Their fingers were too stiff to play. They wore gloves with the fingertips cut off. They had to sip hot water between movements to keep their lips from freezing to their instruments. And yet, they were preparing a piece of music that would become the siege's most powerful act of defiance. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. Shostakovich had started composing the symphony before the encirclement, writing the first movement as a depiction of war's encroaching brutality. He finished the later movements after being evacuated to Kuibyshev, but the symphony would always belong to Leningrad. The plan was to perform it in the besieged city itself, a monumental task requiring nearly 100 musicians at a time, when many had already died of starvation. The score was flown in across Lake Ladoga on a thin sheet of microfilm. The orchestra manager, Karl Eliasberg, began recruiting. He found musicians in the trenches of the front lines, in hospitals, in the bread queues. Some came to their first rehearsal on wooden sleds, too weak to walk. The French horn player was dead, and his replacement had only one lung. The percussionist had to be issued larger cymbals because he could barely hold the normal ones. The performance was scheduled for August 9, 1942, the day Hitler had planned to celebrate the fall of Leningrad at the Hotel Astoria. The symphony would be the city's reply. But before that moment of triumph, the city had to survive the spring of '42. When the snow melted, the frozen corpses that had been hidden under drifts were revealed, creating a nightmarish landscape. The sanitation crisis exploded. Thousands of unburied bodies thawed in the warming sun, contaminating the water supply and sparking fears of plague. The authorities organized a massive spring cleanup, drafting every able-bodied citizen to sweep the streets, bury the dead, and clear the rubble. It was a grotesque exercise in triage. They cleared the bodies, but the psychological wounds festered. The survivors were marked by what they had seen and done. Everyone knew someone who had died. Everyone had a story of near death. The city, though still breathing, was a shell of its former self. As the ice road melted, the resupply shifted to barges and small boats, a far more dangerous method under German bombing. The summer of '42 brought a new wave of artillery bombardment, including heavy siege guns on the German lines. The Germans attempted to storm the city again in Operation Nordlicht, but the Red Army's Signavino offensive in August tied up German forces and prevented the assault. The siege held, but the city remained under constant grinding attack. The deeper the siege went, the more the human psyche fractured. Some people became siege hermits, retreating into their apartments and refusing to leave, dying slowly in the dark. Others formed surrogate families, bonding with neighbors over the simple act of surviving another day. The line between life and death became blurred. Survivors reported losing all sense of time, all sense of self. One man wrote in his diary, "Is this my body, or did it get swapped for somebody else's without me noticing? My legs and wrists are like a growing child's. My stomach has caved in. My ribs stick out from top to bottom." He was a grown man, but starvation had reduced him to a physical state worse than infancy. Now, consider this. In the heart of the city, there was a place where the most precious commodity was not bread but seeds. The Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, a world-famous seed bank, held a collection of over 200,000 plant species collected from across the globe. When the siege began, the Institute's scientists faced an impossible choice. They were surrounded by edible seeds: rice, wheat, peas, potatoes. They were starving, but the collection was considered a priceless genetic treasure for all of humanity. So they guarded it. They set up a rotation to watch the vaults. They sealed the doors. They did not eat a single seed. One after another, the scientists died of starvation. A groundnut specialist named Alexander Shchukin perished at his desk, surrounded by samples of peanuts. The rice curator, Georgy Kryer, died with a bag of rice within arm's reach. The potato curator, Abraham Kamaraz, likewise. 9 scientists starved to death protecting the collection. Their sacrifice, almost too noble to comprehend, stands as the anti-cannibalism. The absolute refusal to consume, even when consuming would have saved them, because they believed that the future was worth more than their own lives. As the siege dragged into its second year, the city learned to exist in a state of suspended animation. Gardens were planted in every vacant lot, in parks and squares. Cabbage and potatoes sprouted from soil made of rubble and ash. The summer of '42 saw an incredible sight. The front of St. Isaac's Cathedral covered in potato plants. The city was slowly transforming from a passive victim into an active survivor. But the real breakthrough came in January 1943, when the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, or Spark. After months of preparation, Soviet forces attacked the narrow German-held corridor south of Lake Ladoga. On January 18th, they broke through. A land corridor, just 8 to 10 kilometers wide, was established. A railway was laid down in 17 days flat under constant enemy fire. The first train rolled into Leningrad on February 7th, bringing butter, meat, and hope. The siege had not been lifted, but it had been cracked. The lifting of the land blockade, however, did not end the suffering. The corridor was under continuous shelling, earning it the name the Corridor of Death. Trains were hit, tracks destroyed, and the journey in was so dangerous that the train drivers were considered frontline soldiers. But the supplies allowed the bread ration to finally increase to something approaching a subsistence level. The city began to recover, but the memory of the first winter would never fade. The siege was not completely broken for another year, until January 27, 1944, when a final Soviet offensive pushed the Germans back beyond artillery range. By then, more than 1 million civilians had died. Only 600,000 of the original 2.5 million population remained in the city. The rest were dead, evacuated, or missing. But the question that lingers, the one we are still trying to answer, is not simply how many died. It is what those who survived carried with them. The siege left an invisible scar on the psyche of every survivor, a scar that would be passed down through generations. It changed the way they looked at food, at waste, at life itself. To this day, in some St. Petersburg apartments, old women who lived through the siege keep a small stash of dried bread in a drawer, just in case. The hunger never really left. And yet, in the middle of all that horror, there was a moment that became a legend, a moment when music fought back against starvation. On August 9, 1942, in the Philharmonic Hall, an orchestra of ghostly musicians raised their instruments and played Shostakovich's Seventh, the Leningrad Symphony. The performance was broadcast across the city on loudspeakers and aimed at the German lines. For 80 minutes, the sound of defiance drowned out the artillery. One German soldier later wrote that when he heard that symphony, he knew they had lost. Not the battle for the city, but the war. Because a people who could create such beauty while starving to death could never be conquered. That is the story we will step into next. The day a city of the dead made music, and how a symphony became a weapon. The date was August 9, 1942. Adolf Hitler had designated this day to host a victory banquet at Leningrad's Hotel Astoria, toasting the obliteration of the city he despised. Instead, inside the Philharmonic Hall, a miracle was unfolding. The hall was packed, not with German officers, but with gaunt civilians and Red Army soldiers in clean uniforms, hastily issued to restore a semblance of dignity. The chandeliers were dark, the temperature still near freezing even in summer, but the warmth came from the stage. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra, swollen to nearly 100 musicians scraped from the front lines and hospital beds, lifted their instruments. Conductor Karl Eliasberg raised a baton that looked comically large in his skeletal hand. And then, the first notes of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, filled the air. The performance was more than a concert. It was a military operation. Soviet artillery had launched a preparatory barrage hours earlier to suppress the German guns, ensuring that not a single shell would interrupt the performance. Loudspeakers carried the music across the silent streets and out into no man's land. German soldiers, listening in their trenches, heard the defiant swell of strings and brass. One later wrote that the symphony was a revelation of the Russian soul, and that, at that moment, he knew Germany could never win. The most famous movement, the so-called invasion theme, was a repetitive, grinding march that built and built a musical embodiment of the Nazi war machine's relentless approach. But then, it was answered by a mournful, beautiful counter-melody, a voice of resilience. As the final movement surged toward its triumphant conclusion, many in the audience wept. They were not tears of joy, but of catharsis, a release of 11 months of terror, hunger, and grief. The city of the dead had spoken, and what it said was, "We are still human." But the symphony, for all its symbolic power, could not feed a single person. The land corridor opened in January 1943, provided a thin lifeline, but the German army still controlled the high ground. The corridor of death, as it was called, was a hellscape of constant shelling and bombardment. The railway that Stalin had ordered, built in 17 days, was a target-rich environment. Trains full of evacuees and supplies were hit daily. The bodies of passengers were thrown from the cars by the trackside. Engineers worked under fire, repairing the line with bare hands. Aerial photographs from the era show the corridor as a bruised scar through the white snow, pockmarked with craters. To travel its length was to play a lethal game of chance. And yet, trains kept running. By the spring of '43, the bread ration climbed to 600 grams for workers. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the entire city was eating a diet that, while meager, would not kill them within weeks. Vegetables from the Victory Gardens, planted in every park, helped sustain the population. But the danger was far from over. The relief of the land corridor brought a new, insidious tragedy. Malnutrition had so devastated the population that the sudden increase in calories triggered a wave of deaths. Bodies that had adapted to starvation could not process the influx of food. The condition, known as refeeding syndrome, caused cardiac failure and metabolic collapse. Doctors, themselves weakened, scrambled to understand why patients were dying immediately after being fed. It was one more cruel layer in the siege's medical nightmare. Hospitals were full of people who, having survived the hunger winter, were now succumbing to the arrival of bread. The psychological landscape was even more complex. Survivors of the darkest months carried a burden that would never fully lift. A term emerged: siege mentality. It described a set of behaviors that included hoarding food obsessively, an inability to discard even spoiled scraps, and a deep-seated suspicion of authority. Those who had eaten human flesh, whether out of desperation or malice, lived with unspeakable guilt. The NKVD's cannibalism trials continued, and the city was forced to confront the question of legal versus moral culpability. A young mother who had fed her children with meat cut from a corpse was treated as a victim of circumstance, often receiving a light sentence. A gang leader who had murdered specifically to sell human meat was shot, but the lines blurred. The official policy was to minimize public knowledge of the phenomenon to prevent panic, but the rumors persisted. Every survivor knew someone who had crossed the line, or had almost crossed it themselves. One of the most haunting artifacts from the siege is a diary kept not by a writer, but by an ordinary archivist named Nikolai Gorshkov. Throughout the siege, he meticulously recorded the weather, the rations, the number of deaths, and his own deteriorating mental state. His entries grow shorter and more erratic as starvation takes hold. On February 3, 1942, he wrote, "I am turning into an animal. No thoughts, only hunger. My wife lies beside me, and I look at her and think about how many calories are in her body." He did not act on this thought. He and his wife both survived, but he never forgave himself for having it. His diary, published decades later, is a testament to the inner war that every Leningrader fought. Then there was the case of the bread man of Leningrad, Danil Kutinin, a baker at one of the city's bread factories. He died of starvation on February 3, 1942, at his work table. His crime? He had never taken a single extra gram of bread for himself, despite having access to the city's supply. He could have eaten in secret, but he didn't. He weighed out the rations and handed them over, and then went home and starved. His story was used by Soviet propaganda to illustrate the city's moral fortitude, but its truth is more profound. In a place where bread was life, the man who baked it chose death rather than betray the trust of his neighbors. It is easy to focus on the cannibals and the thieves, but Kutinin's quiet sacrifice is the counterweight. The siege produced both the worst and the best of humanity, often in the same block, the same building, the same family. The children of the siege carried a particular scar. After the war, psychologists studied the Leningrad children as a distinct cohort. Many had witnessed the deaths of parents and siblings. Some had been forced to become the caretakers of dying adults at age 8 or 9. They learned to read death's approach in the pallor of a face. They lost the ability to cry. Their emotional development was frozen. In the post-war years, they were often quiet, withdrawn, unable to form attachments easily. The siege had taught them that love was a liability, because anyone you loved could be taken by mourning. This intergenerational trauma rippled outward, affecting the children and grandchildren of survivors. The siege was not over in 1944. It was passed down in DNA, in family stories, in the way food was treated as sacred. But even as the city clawed its way back from the edge, the war was not finished with Leningrad. The spring of 1943 brought a surprising threat: a typhus epidemic. The lice that had infested everyone during the unwashed winter months now spread disease. The authorities launched a massive delousing campaign, setting up public baths and cutting hair. Soap, that rare commodity, became a weapon of war. The epidemic was contained, but it was a reminder that the city was still in a state of extreme precarity. German long-range artillery continued to shell the center, targeting hospitals, schools, and the Hermitage Museum. The shells were part of a strategy of psychological exhaustion. Every day, a random person was killed. The randomness was the point. You could survive starvation, you could survive the cold, but you might be walking down Nevsky Prospect and be vaporized by a shell. The city was never entirely safe. The siege was finally completely broken on January 27, 1944. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, a massive Soviet operation involving over 1 million troops, pushed Army Group North back 200 kilometers. After 872 days, Leningrad was no longer surrounded. The official announcement was made at 8 p.m. The city erupted in celebration, but it was a muted, exhausted joy. People lit bonfires, shot flares, and embraced, but many were too weak to join the crowds. They watched from their windows, too tired to celebrate, still processing what they had endured. The first train from Moscow arrived a few days later, carrying food, mail, and a sense that the world had finally remembered them. The death toll was almost incomprehensible. Official Soviet figures initially claimed 632,000 dead, a number that was later revised upward. Modern historians estimate that between 1.5 and 1.8 million civilians perished, either in the city or during evacuation. That is approximately as many total deaths as the entire United Kingdom, civilian and military, suffered in the entire Second World War. In Leningrad, the majority of those deaths were civilians, and the vast majority of those civilians died from hunger. The scale of loss reshaped the city's demographics. Entire families were erased. Some apartment blocks stood completely empty, their former inhabitants buried in mass graves at the Piskaryovskoye cemetery, where long grassy mounds stretch for acres, covering the dead in anonymity. But the story of the siege does not end with liberation. The aftermath was its own kind of hell. The city had to be rebuilt, But first, the bodies had to be counted. Tens of thousands remained unburied, hidden in apartments or under rubble. The sanitation infrastructure was destroyed. The psychological rehabilitation of the survivors was an undertaking the Soviet state was not equipped for. Moreover, the siege was quickly mythologized by the Stalinist regime. The narrative was curated, the heroism of the party, the resistance of the working class, the evil of the Nazis, the uncomfortable truths, the cannibalism, the massive bureaucratic failures, the initial indifference of Moscow were erased from official discourse. Leningrad became the hero city, a shining symbol of Soviet defiance, but the messy, ugly reality was buried as deep as the corpses, and this is where the question of genocide arises. Hitler's directive was explicit: no surrender. The city was to be wiped out. The starvation was not an incidental byproduct of military operations. It was the weapon. The siege was a policy of deliberate annihilation of a civilian population. Modern legal scholars have applied the term genocide, though the concept did not exist as a crime in international law at the time. The Nuremberg trials did not indict anyone specifically for the Siege of Leningrad, though the general German conduct was condemned. The city itself became a witness. Streets like the Avenue of the 25th of October were renamed. The scars were hidden in plain sight. Years later, residents would still find unexploded shells in their gardens. The war lived on beneath the soil. The legacy of the siege is also a story of memory and forgetting. In the late 1950s, under Khrushchev, a wave of memorialization began. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery received its monumental motherland statue. The Leningrad Siege Museum was opened, only to be closed again when Brezhnev came to power and found its narrative too bleak. The siege became a form of underground memory, kept alive by survivors in kitchens and on anniversaries. In the 1980s and 90s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the full, unvarnished truth began to emerge. Diaries were published. Testimonies were recorded. The cannibalism files were finally opened. The siege could finally be discussed in all its horror, and the question that emerged was not merely historical, but philosophical. What does it mean for a city that has consumed itself, in some cases literally, to be reborn? Today, St. Petersburg is a vibrant, beautiful city, but its residents still carry the siege in their bones. Every year on January 27th, there is a moment of silence. The metronome is broadcast again. Survivors, now very old, visit the cemeteries. The city's memory is not a monolith of heroism, it is a haunted landscape. There are still those who, when they see a piece of bread on the ground, pick it up, kiss it, and put it somewhere safe. Because bread was life. Because in 872 days, 1,000,000 people who would have done the same were not there to do it. The final question we must now confront is this: if the siege was a crime against humanity, who was accountable? And what does justice look like when the guilty are already dead, and the survivors are the only ones left to tell the tale? The answer lies in the stories we choose to remember and the ones we try to forget. And as we step into the final act, we will walk through the haunted corridors of Leningrad's memory, where the ghosts of the hungry winters still whisper, and we will ask what it means to carry the weight of 1,000,000 souls. That journey begins now. The siege was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. When the last German artillery shell fell on Leningrad on January 22, 1944, and the Red Army's final offensive swept the enemy beyond the horizon, the city exhaled. But what emerged from the rubble was not the Leningrad of 1941. It was a ghost of itself, populated by survivors who had witnessed the absolute floor of human existence. The question that haunted every street corner, every communal kitchen, every eyes cast down encounter, was not simply, how do we rebuild? But, how do we live with what we did? The physical reconstruction of Leningrad was a monumental undertaking. Over 1,000,000 square meters of housing had been destroyed. The city's infrastructure was a corpse. The Hermitage Museum, its treasures evacuated to Siberia, was a hollow shell scarred by shrapnel. The Peterhof Palace had been gutted and mined. The Pavlovsk Palace was a ruin. But the Soviet state, which had been slow to save the city during the siege, poured resources into its resurrection afterward. The political importance of Leningrad as a symbol of Soviet endurance demanded nothing less. Within a decade, the palaces were restored, the boulevards repaved, the factories rebuilt. By the 1950s, a visitor walking down Nevsky Prospect might have seen little obvious evidence of the siege. But the physical scars were the easy ones to heal. The invisible wounds were far more stubborn. The psychological state of the survivors was something Soviet psychiatry was ill-equipped to handle. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnosis in the Soviet Union. The very idea of mental illness caused by war was politically suspect, suggesting weakness when the party demanded strength. Survivors were expected to integrate back into society, to work, to produce, to celebrate their heroic city, and to remain silent about the darkness. And so they did, outwardly. They went to their jobs. They stood in lines. They attended the official commemorations. But privately, the siege lived on. They hoarded food obsessively. They could not throw away a dried crust of bread without feeling physical pain. They startled at loud noises. They woke at night, convinced they had heard the metronome stop, the signal of an imminent air raid. And they did not speak of the worst things they had seen. The silence was not just personal. It was enforced by the state. In the immediate post-war years, the official narrative of the siege was carefully curated. The failures of the city administration, the initial chaos of evacuation, the massive scale of the Badaev warehouse fire, the black market, and above all, the cannibalism, were all suppressed. The siege was presented as a pure story of heroic resistance, led by the party and the working class, with all moral complexity sanded away. The Leningrad Siege Museum, which opened in 1946 and displayed artifacts of the famine, was abruptly closed in 1953 during the so-called Leningrad Affair, a brutal political purge of the city's leadership by Stalin. Thousands of party officials and intellectuals were arrested, and many executed. The museum's director was shot. The exhibits were destroyed or hidden. The message was clear. The memory of the siege would be controlled, or it would not exist. This suppression created a schism in the city's soul. There was the official memory, the medals, the monuments, the school lessons about the hero city. And then there was the underground memory, the whispered truths shared among survivors in private kitchens, the diaries hidden in drawers, the stories passed from grandmothers to grandchildren in hushed tones. As the decades passed, these two memories coexisted, uncomfortable twins. Survivors who had seen cannibalism, who had eaten leather and paste, and worse, were expected to march in victory parades and smile. Many could not. They withdrew. They became the siege people, a distinct psychological tribe within the city, recognizable by a certain faraway look in their eyes. Then came the reckoning that had been deferred for decades. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the archives began to open. The secret NKVD files on cannibalism were finally accessible. The diaries of the dead were published, their raw, unfiltered accounts challenging the sanitized myth. The American historian John Barber called the siege the greatest demographic catastrophe ever experienced by one city in the history of mankind. The numbers were revised upward. The death toll was no longer 600,000, but well over 1 million. The truth, in all its horror, was finally allowed to breathe. One of the most powerful voices of this reckoning was the poet Olga Bergholz. Her name became synonymous with the siege because her voice had been the one on the radio, speaking to the starving city every day, keeping its spirit alive. She had stayed in Leningrad throughout the blockade, losing her husband to starvation. Her poems were simple, direct, and devastating. After the war, she became the conscience of the survivors, refusing to let the official narrative erase the agony. She was instrumental in the creation of the Piskaryovskoy Memorial Cemetery, where the majority of the siege dead are buried in mass graves. At the entrance, her words are carved in stone. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. It was a defiant statement, a promise that the dead would not be erased, even if the state tried to scrub the memory. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery is a place that must be visited to be understood. It sits on the northern edge of the city, a vast green expanse of nearly endless burial mounds. Each long, low mound covers thousands of bodies, interred, without coffins, without names, layered in the frozen ground during the winter of 41 to 42. At the far end stands a bronze statue of the motherland, a woman holding a wreath. The scale is overwhelming. Walking the paths between the mounds, you realize that the grass covers not a few hundred, not a few thousand, but nearly 500,000 souls, and that is only a fraction of the total dead. The silence there is not peaceful. It is heavy, freighted with the weight of so much suffering. Visitors often break down without knowing why. The place itself seems to remember, but the question of accountability lingers. Who was responsible for the siege? At the Nuremberg trials, the German High Command was condemned for crimes against humanity, but the specific charge of genocide for the Siege of Leningrad was not prosecuted as a distinct crime. The concept of genocide had only just been codified, and the focus was on the Holocaust. Yet the siege fits the modern legal definition of genocide, the deliberate destruction of a population in whole or in part. Hitler's directive, issued on September 29, 1941, stated explicitly that the city was to be wiped off the face of the earth. The Wehrmacht's own Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner wrote that the city must be starved into submission. The policy of destroying Leningrad's civilian population through starvation was not a side effect of war, it was the war aim. The German commander of the forces blockading the city, Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, and his successor, Georg von Küchler, both received the order to reject any surrender and to shell any civilians trying to leave. They followed it, and yet neither was tried specifically for the siege. Lieb was convicted at the High Command trial in 1948, but his sentence was relatively light and he was released early. Küchler was sentenced to 20 years, but served only 7. The Soviet Union executed thousands of captured German soldiers after the war, but the architects of the starvation largely escaped direct justice. This injustice is a raw nerve in St. Petersburg to this day. Every year on the anniversary of the liberation, questions resurface about why the perpetrators were not held to a higher account. But accountability is not only a matter of international courts, it is also a matter of historical memory. In the 1990s and 2000s, a movement grew among survivors and historians to have the siege recognized as an act of genocide under international law. In 2008, the Russian Duma considered a resolution to this effect, but it stalled. Some scholars argue that the label is politically charged, that it risks diluting the term. Others say that to refuse the label is to minimize the crime. The debate is ongoing, but for the survivors, the distinction matters little. They lived through a deliberate attempt to exterminate them, and whether the world calls it genocide or not, the trauma is the same. The burden of memory also falls on the next generations. The children and grandchildren of survivors carry what psychologists call transmitted trauma. They grew up in households where food was treated with near religious reverence, where wasting a crumb was unthinkable, where the stories of the siege were either omnipresent or entirely absent, with no middle ground. Many second-generation Leningraders describe a childhood overshadowed by an unnamed dread, a sense that something terrible had happened before they were born and could happen again. They inherited the siege without having lived it, and now, as the last survivors die of old age, the city faces the question of how to remember when the living witnesses are gone. The answer is partly in the monuments, the museums, the school curricula, and the annual Day of the Liberation, when the metronome is broadcast once more and the city stops to remember. But perhaps the most profound answer is in the small, private acts of memory that survive in St. Petersburg homes. To this day, you can find old women and men who keep a dried piece of bread in their cupboard, not to eat, but as a talisman. They will tell you that the bread reminds them of the hunger, but also of the moment they were saved. They kiss the bread before throwing it away, if it molds, as a sign of respect. They remember the taste of that black, sawdust-laden loaf, and in remembering, they keep the dead with them. This is the legacy of the siege, a legacy that cannot be captured in any official monument or history book. It lives in the gestures of the everyday. The siege also transformed the relationship between the city and the state. After the war, Leningraders had a unique, somewhat cynical perspective on authority. They had been abandoned, then rescued, then celebrated, then silenced. They knew that the state's memory was unreliable. This skepticism became part of the city's identity, contributing to the underground culture of dissent that flourished in Leningrad in the later Soviet period. The city that had survived the worst that history could throw at it was not easily impressed by propaganda. And then there is the final surprising detail, one that often gets lost in the scale of the tragedy. The Vavilov Institute, whose scientists starved to death protecting seeds, was not destroyed. After the war, the institute reopened. The seeds that the curators died to protect were replanted. Some of the varieties that were safeguarded during the siege eventually became the basis for new crops that helped feed the Soviet Union in the post-war years. The sacrifice of those 9 scientists literally bore fruit. In a story dominated by death, this is a thread of life that reaches into the future. It is a reminder that the siege was not only about destruction, but also about the stubborn, irrational persistence of hope. But hope was not always a comfort. For many survivors, the end of the siege brought a crushing realization. The ones they had fought to stay alive for were gone. There is a diary entry from a woman named Vera Inber, who survived the siege with her husband. After the liberation, she wrote, "We are alive, but we are not the same people. We have seen too much. We have become too thin, not just in body, but in soul. The city is free, but we are still in the siege. We will always be in the siege." This sense of being permanently marked, of carrying the famine inside, is perhaps the truest legacy of the blockade. The siege was a wound that never fully healed, a presence that never left. As we approach the final chapter of this story, we need to turn to the question of closure, or rather, the impossibility of it. What does it mean to survive the unsurvivable? To carry the memory of 1,000,000 dead and still find a reason to laugh, to love, to trust? The Siege of Leningrad was not just a historical event, it was an existential test. It asked what a human being is worth when reduced to a calorie count. It asked whether civilization is a thin veneer that can be stripped away, or a deep structure that holds even when the bodies fall. The answer, as always, is complicated. There were those who sank to the absolute depths, and there were those who rose to unimaginable heights. Most people simply endured, somewhere in between, doing what they had to do to see another sunrise. Now, as the night deepens and we prepare to leave the frozen streets of Leningrad, we must ask one last question. If this could happen once, could it happen again? And what do we owe, not just to the dead, but to the living, who still carry the weight of 872 days in their bones? The answer lies in the silence of the Piskaryovskoye mounds, in the faded handwriting of Tanya Savicheva's diary, in the echo of Shostakovich's symphony still hanging in the frozen air, and in the quiet act of an old woman in St. Petersburg, kissing a crust of bread before she places it gently aside. That is where we are headed now, into the silence that follows the story, where the dead still speak if we have the courage to listen. And so we arrive at the silence that followed the last artillery shell, the silence of the Piskaryovskoye mounds under a blanket of snow, the silence of a grandmother in St. Petersburg who, when asked about the siege, simply shakes her head and looks away because no words are adequate. That silence is not empty. It is full. It contains the weight of 1,000,000 souls who slipped away in frozen apartments, on icy streets, in the long bread lines that stretched through the dark. It contains the choices that no human should ever have to make, and the choices that, somehow, were made with a dignity that defies explanation. The Siege of Leningrad was a crime, a catastrophe, a genocide by deliberate starvation. But it was also something else. It was a mirror held up to the human condition at its most extreme. What the survivors taught us, and what the dead demand we remember, is that civilization is not a guarantee. It is a fragile construction that can be dismantled by hunger in a matter of weeks. The line between the bakery and the cannibal's market is thinner than we want to believe. And yet, there was Daniil Kutinin, the baker who starved rather than steal a single extra gram of bread. There were the 9 scientists of the Vavilov Institute who died guarding seeds they could have eaten because they believed in a future they would not live to see. There was the Leningrad Radio Orchestra, playing Shostakovich with frozen fingers, proving that beauty is not a luxury, but a form of resistance. There were the thousands of ordinary people who, in the depths of the hunger winter, shared their last crust with a weaker neighbor, who pulled a stranger's body on a sled to a burial mound, who kept the metronome of the human spirit ticking when everything else had stopped. These acts do not cancel out the horror, but they sit alongside it, inextricable. The same city that produced cannibals produced saints. The same winter that froze the Neva also froze the human heart in some chests, while in others it forged a resolve so fierce it still radiates warmth 80 years later. The lesson of Leningrad is not a simple moral. It is a riddle. It asks each of us, if we were given a ration card of 125 grams of sawdust bread, if we watched our children swell with edema, if we heard the whispers of what was being sold in the Haymarket, what would we do? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that not knowing is the beginning of humility, the beginning of a true reckoning with what the siege means. Today, St. Petersburg is a city of canals and cathedrals, of tourists and cafes. The siege can feel very far away, but it is not. It is in the DNA of every family that lived through it. It is in the way bread is treated, in the way the city's older residents still startle at the rumble of a low-flying plane. It is in the annual ritual of the metronome, broadcast on January 27th, when the whole city pauses to listen to the same steady beat that told the starving that somewhere, someone was still alive, still operating the radio, still refusing to surrender. That metronome is the pulse of memory, and memory is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. The Siege of Leningrad happened in a world at war, but the strategy of starvation has not been retired to the history books. It has been used in Biafra, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Gaza. The deliberate targeting of civilian food supplies is a weapon that keeps being wielded because it works. The Siege of Leningrad is an extreme case, but it is also a warning. It shows us where the logic of starvation leads. It shows us the endpoint of a policy that treats human beings as obstacles to be erased. And it shows us, too, the incredible difficulty of accountability. If the architects of Leningrad's suffering largely escaped justice, what does that say about the international community's capacity to protect civilians from the same fate? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. The sleep of history should be disturbed by them. But we are not here tonight only to dwell in darkness. We are here to honor a story that, for all its horror, is ultimately about endurance. The city did not die. The people did not all perish. Out of a pre-siege population of nearly 3,600,000 survived to see the liberation. They emerged from their basements and their frozen apartments into the pale January light, and they began again. They cleared the rubble, they buried the dead, They planted potatoes in the parks of the czars. They sang. They married. They had children, and they told those children what had happened, or they did not tell them because the telling was too painful. Either way, the life force asserted itself. The city rebuilt, and in that rebuilding there is a message that reaches across time to us right now, in this moment. The message is that survival itself can be a form of defiance. That when the world tries to erase you, to starve you into non-existence, the simple act of continuing to breathe, to hope, to plant a seed, to play a symphony, to kiss a crust of bread, is a victory. Not a victory that negates the loss, but a victory that refuses to let the loss be the final word. The dead of Leningrad are gone, but they are not forgotten. They live on in the stories we tell, in the silence we keep, in the questions we ask. They live on in the shiver you feel when you imagine standing in a bread line in 30 below zero cold, holding a ration card that promises you 125 grams of life. They live on in the vibration of that metronome, still ticking, still steady, still saying the words that Olga Bergold spoke to her starving listeners. No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten. As we prepare to leave Leningrad and return to our own warm beds, I want to leave you with one final image. It is the spring of 1942. The worst winter in human history has finally ended. The ice on Lake Ladoga is melting, and the road of life will soon be water again. In a small apartment on the Petrograd side, a woman who has lost her husband and both her children stands at her window. She is a wraith, barely 80 pounds, her hair gray and brittle. She is looking at a small pot on her windowsill. In it, she has planted a single onion, salvaged from the frozen ground. A green shoot is emerging. She stares at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in months, she smiles. The siege is not over. She may not survive the next week, but that green shoot is proof that the world still contains growth, still contains possibility, still contains something that is not death. She waters it with a thimble of melted snow and goes back inside to face another day. That is what Leningrad teaches us. Not that suffering is noble, but that hope, however irrational, is a biological imperative. It pushes through frozen soil. It pushes through shattered concrete. It pushes through the human heart, even when that heart has been broken 1,000 times. It is the green shoot in the window of a dying city, and it is the reason the city did not die. Thank you for spending this time in Leningrad. Thank you for bearing witness to a story that is not easy, but is essential. If these walls could speak, as your own walls listen, they would ask only one thing, that you remember. Not the dates or the statistics, but the faces. Tanya Savicheva, writing in her little diary until the very end. Karl Eliasberg, lifting his baton with a skeleton hand to conduct a symphony of defiance. The unnamed mother who fed her children by whatever means she could, and lived with the consequences. The baker who starved with bread in his hands. The scientist who died with rice at his fingertips. The old woman in St. Petersburg who, tonight, kissed a crust before laying it aside. Carry them with you. Let their story settle into your bones, and, as you drift towards sleep, listen to the metronome in your own chest, steady and sure, a reminder that you are alive, that you are fed, that you are warm, and that these simple facts are not guaranteed for anyone. They are gifts, hard-won by the survivors of history's darkest hours. If these stories have meant something to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is the simplest way to keep the memory alive. Drop a comment below telling us where you are listening from and what time it is for you. There is something quietly powerful about knowing that, across the world, people are lying in the dark, listening together to the same tale of human endurance. It is its own kind of metronome, a pulse of connection in the night. Now, let the silence settle. Pull your blankets close. Feel the warmth that the people of Leningrad dreamed of for 872 nights. And know that somewhere in the frozen memory of that city, a green shoot is still growing. Sleep well.